Hello, everybody. It's 1 o'clock. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Give some people time to show up. Not everybody is as punctual as you are. It would be absolutely fantastic if you could let me know if you could hear me, though. So if you could just type into the chat and let me know that you could hear me, that would be great. I've also configured a poll, and I'm not entirely sure where it shows up on your screen, but I'm sure it shows up somewhere. Yay, all right, welcome, David Betts. Oh my gosh, you're scrolling so fast. Well, it's good to see everybody. I'm not going to be able to read those names that fast, that's for sure. Hello from Holland, that one stands out. There's a poll that I've configured so that you can basically direct what I say, really sort of right from the start. Oh, great. Some of you are finding it already, so that's fantastic. Good. Must be easy to find in your interface. I've, of course, got the presenter interface, so we'll see. And I'm just going to sort of chill out for another minute or so here, and we'll let people continue to pop in. Looks like about 36% of people or so that have registered are here so far, so I'll give it just a few more minutes. I know that sometimes when I try to log into these things, I have difficulty, and like the first time I try to log in, it doesn't work, and then I've got to restart something, and I've got to try it again, and I don't want to lose out on anything because they've already started and all of that. So I don't want to do that to anyone else. We know how that goes. Hi, David. Love you too. Hi, Mike in Australia. Like 12 hours? No, it wouldn't be quite 12 hours different because I'm not on the East Coast time, but it's got to be pretty early there, huh? All right, so I'm going to mute myself for just about a minute, and then we will get started. Also give you time to do the poll and stuff. Might be fun for everybody to say where they're from. I'm kind of enjoying seeing that with Houston and San Diego and Oregon and along those lines. Hello, Laura and Steve and Wynn and Margaret and Asheville and whatever else. That's kind of fun. We really do have, you know, people literally from all over the world that view our materials and consume stuff from us and all of that. So Tucson, right on. And of course, I don't have to wonder which Rebecca that is. That is the, at this point, ultra famous Rebecca from Finders Course One, I'm quite sure, down there in Texas. Wow, look at that. All over. Oh, the UK, great. The mountains of British Columbia, Canada. Well, feel free to not have to look at my face on the screen too much if you've got a great one out your window there. I was just in the mountains last weekend myself. Holland, London, Denmark. It's good. I tried to pick a good time when I thought we could hit, you know, the sort of the maximum number of people. It's kind of tough if you're over in Asia Pacific. Spain, wow, great. Okay, I'm going to turn on the camera. No sound in Provence. Well, that doesn't sound good. If anybody else has difficulty hearing me, just let me know and we'll troubleshoot it. I have a little meter here that's going, so it looks like you should be able to hear me okay, but that's not always the case. You never know. Let me flip over to the poll here real quick first. So the poll right now is at 62%. I want to reach PNSE, and 37%, I'm already in PNSE. That's kind of incredible if you think about it. Can you imagine that on this webinar, 37% of people that filled out the poll are in PNSE? That's just incredible, especially if you think back to when I first started this. And, you know, people were trying to convince me that you'll never find more than a handful of PNSE people to research, and, you know, good luck even getting them to commit to your research and all that stuff. And yet here we have a huge chunk of people on the call that are experiencing PNSE. So how awesome is that? I was really surprised by that. I think you all saw the follow-up video to the survey where I said I was really stunned, because I thought for sure that like 80% of people would say, oh, I want to reach PNSE. And only a tiny percent of people would actually say, I'm in PNSE and I want to deepen or progress or whatever else. And it didn't turn out to be that way at all. So it was really kind of fascinating. Okay, Uruguay. Wow. All right. That's cool. You know, there's a lot of growth going on actually in Central and South America and whatnot right now. I was talking to my friends over at the Chopra Center, Deepak, of course, but also some of his crack helpers that basically keep everything running over there. And they are really, really expanding into Central and South America because there's a lot of hunger down there for this type of thing. In fact, they're starting to do bilingual programs here in the States, and people are coming from Central and South America and they're getting simultaneous translation into Spanish while they're actually in their programs. So there's a lot of growth going on down there. So welcome, Uruguay. All right, let's, I'm going to go with the vote here. And so the vote currently is 66 to 34%. I want to reach PNSE. So I think it's only fair that we start with reaching PNSE. Sorry if my camera is shaking a little bit here. I'm switching around between screens and my notes and your poll and stuff like that. So one of the things I thought was very interesting in terms of comments about people wanting to reach PNSE is that it seems like an awful lot of you have had temporary glimpses of this already. And I talked about this a little bit in the video because of that. You know, I could see when you would describe these different types of temporary experiences that oftentimes you were regarding them as potentially sort of in the right direction when they weren't in the right direction. So if you don't know what I'm talking about there, you can go and pick it up in a little bit more detail in the video. But one of the things that really sort of stood out for me was this notion that any glimpse of non-symbolic experience is probably in the direction of persistent non-symbolic experience. And this is something that we've really only been able to get data on in the last year or so ourselves. In fact, if you would have talked to me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have probably felt the same way and believed the same way and thought the same thing, because I'm not an expert in temporary forms. I've only researched persistent forms. And so for all of the earlier portions of the research, when I would ask people to describe their persistent non-symbolic experience and they would bring up temporary things, I just never really dug into their temporary things that they talked about having happened to them before PNSE. But because we've been running the Finders course for so long now, we've been able to see a lot of different things happening, including people who are getting into temporary versus persistent experiences. It's not uncommon for a certain percentage, I wouldn't call it a majority even, of people who take the Finders course, but it's not uncommon for a certain percentage of people that take the Finders course to have temporary glimpses of non-symbolic experience before they actually settle in to persistence. And what we've learned over time is that there's a couple of different forms of that. And then I was actually able to experience this myself. I went to a neurofeedback program that was operated by a friend of mine who was kind enough to invite me down to experience his program for a week. And I think he's probably, I think it's very safe to say really that there's nobody in the world that's better at generating sort of peak experiences in the neurofeedback environment than he is. And he uses alpha training, but he also will train on other brain waves as you get better at the alpha training and stuff. The interesting thing about it is that while I was in the training about, I think it was maybe a day, it might have been a half a day in, or it was a day and a half in, I can't remember now because it's been about a year. But whatever it was, at a certain point, I began to be pulled out of non-duality. So most of you, I think, know, because I say this publicly these days, I try to keep myself right around the end of location 2. And I was sitting in this neurofeedback chamber, and all of a sudden I started to feel kind of weird. And I was thinking, oh, maybe it's working, maybe what he's talking about is happening here. And so, my alpha levels are increasing. And this is what's, this is part of what you're supposed to feel associated with this. And fascinating to me was that then I noticed that the tones that I was listening to in the neurofeedback were outside of me. And I was feeling weird because it had been quite a long time since I'd experienced something outside of me, right? The idea and the experience of non-duality is that stuff really isn't outside of you. It's all just sort of here. It's kind of one thing. It's all just showing up. And so I was like, whoa, uh-oh. This is not going in the right direction. And so I spent the rest of that session just kind of fighting as best I could to stay in non-duality. And then after the session, I'm like, I'm not doing any more of these. But then we talked about it for quite a while, maybe an hour even. And over that hour, I drifted very solidly back in. And I thought, okay, well, I'll play with this. And I wound up finishing out the training, but being very, very, very careful. And sometimes I just stay awake all night to try to reroute myself back into location 2. And whatnot. So if you're not familiar with the locations, you can check out our summary paper at nonsymbolic.org. It's one word, nonsymbolic.org/publications. You can, of course, just click on the publications link when you get there. And that'll tell you sort of this taxonomy that I'm talking about. Probably you'll pick up some from this webinar today. You'll probably pick up some stuff from maybe other videos and stuff that you've seen. So that taught me that he was really the best in the world at engineering a very certain form of peak experience, and he'd gotten very good at it over the course of 40 years. And what he describes is basically people coming in who are, senior executives and people who are just very, very, very rooted in their minds. And he's able to bust them out of that, which that's absolutely true. And that's a very, very powerful experience to give someone who's rooted in their mind, to sort of show them a glimpse of what's beyond it. But what it taught me experientially was that it was in the opposite direction of sort of persistent forms of it. In other words, by increasing the brain waves that he wanted me to experience, it was not deepening or having a positive impact on my persistent experience of non-symbolic experience, right? So I've even seen it from that standpoint. We've seen it a lot in the course. And if you go back and you look at Abraham Maslow's work, and I'm a big fan of Maslow. Maslow started transpersonal psychology. He was one of the founders of humanistic psychology. He was a leader of the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, which is basically the thing that all of us scholarly academics subscribe to and whatnot. It's kind of our association, one of our core associations. And so he was a big wheel back in the 50s, 60s. He actually died in 1970, a few days before I was born. So I never got to meet him, though I've met a lot of people who did know him. And it was interesting because his work was really focused for most of his career on temporary forms of this experience. And the temporary form of this experience that he really focused on was the one that was not actually in the direction of persistence. And the reason we know that is because he talks a lot about it having this high arousal type of value. And so, you sort of have this rush of energy, this sort of very high arousal sort of form of energy. And what we've seen in the course data over time, what I've seen in my friend's program firsthand and whatnot, is that that type of temporary glimpse of this is something that can happen to people. And when it happens to people, they really think, oh my gosh, that's the thing that I've got to get back to again and again and again and again. And there are two downsides to that. One is that that is not what persistent non-symbolic experience feels like. Maslow himself, towards the end of his life, had a shift into PNSE that he called the plateau experience, trying to sort of keep with his mountainous sort of peak experiences. Mountains have plateaus, that kind of thing. So he's trying to find a good term that stuck with the nomenclature that he was using. So he had this shift in his own consciousness to what he called the plateau experience. And the plateau experience, he noted, was essentially the polar opposite to the peak experience in terms of one had a lot of arousal associated with it, and one was very peaceful. So there are temporary forms of non-symbolic experience that are in the peaceful direction. And I think those are good to sort of grasp onto or latch onto or whatever else if you're experiencing those. So I think the temporary ones are great. They show you that there's sort of a potential for things to go in a certain way. They let you know that you're wired for it. You don't have to wonder anymore about whether or not that's going to work for you. But pursuing those sort of high arousal forms of it are not really what we would recommend at this point in the data from what we've seen. However, if you can shift those into temporary experiences that don't have that arousal associated with it, or you have also, or maybe just exclusively, temporary experiences that don't have that arousal associated with it, those are ones that you can really sort of lock onto and increasingly get access to, and sort of will lead you more likely to persistent non-symbolic experience than not doing that. And so there's really there's not really much of a distinction between that and what we tell people in the course in terms of sinking into non-symbolic experiences when they first get there. And it's clear to me from your survey, actually, and that's actually the first time that has been clear to me, that I need to talk about this in a slightly different way. So if you were taking the Finders course, or if there are people out on the call, well, at least Rebecca's here, and there's some others that I see in there that are or have taken the Finders course. One of the things that you'll see throughout the Finders course is that, especially even right from the very beginning, I say, listen, if you're experiencing, sort of beingness or isness or presence, and I have all these different terms because a different term will resonate with different people. So I have all of these different terms that I use, especially early in the course. I kind of drop them as we go along the course, and we come to a better understanding of what it is that's actually being pursued as the goal. But at the very beginning, I give sort of this list of things that I'm like, if you have any of these things happen to you, then it's okay to basically stop whatever the practice is that we're working on and just sort of sink into that, because that's in the right direction. What I'm really saying there is, if you're having a temporary experience of this, even just a temporary experience that's kind of in the right direction, it's perfectly fine to stop and kind of sink into it. And the reason that I say that is quite simple from a neuroscience standpoint. If you've seen other stuff from me, you know that basically I view things through the lens of neuroscience. Excuse me. So what that means, in effect, is that I think of this as a competition in the brain for energy. And there are circuits that you've established very strongly, and they're getting a lot of support. They're getting a lot of energy. They're getting fed by a lot of blood flow and all of that. They're getting a lot of chemical activity and all of that. And then there are these new circuits that you're starting to get glimpses of when you're having these temporary experiences of non-symbolic experience. And the key is to strengthen those. The key is to get the energy sort of flowing in the brain through those new connections that you're making. And so that's why I recommend essentially sort of sinking into it and whatnot. All right, so there's that. Of course, the other main piece of recommendation that we always do for people who want to get to persistent non-symbolic experience, and I'll just cover this very quickly because I've said it many times before, but it's this notion that fit matters. One of the things that we saw in the research data pretty much from very early on was that lots of people try the same stuff. So, lots of you who are listening to this webinar right now have actually tried a lot of the same methods. But a method that works for one person at one point in their life is not likely to work at a different point in their life, and is not likely to work for someone else, even their closest friend or whatever. And so there's sort of this ethos that's developed out there oftentimes in a lot of these different training traditions and stuff, where someone has a powerful experience with a method and they become convinced that that's the method that everybody should use. And so they're out there teaching that method, and they're out there kind of insisting to other people that this is the method, that you should try and all of that. But the reality is that it's only going to work for a very small percentage of people. And so just to remind you, our primary core piece of advice if you want to transition to PNSE is, first of all, pick something that's worked for a lot more people than other people. And you can find that stuff pretty easily because it's risen to the top of religious and spiritual traditions over the years. If it's not a religious and spiritual system, it will be something like Headless Way that a lot of people talk about having used to get to a certain degree of success. So you're basically looking for the things that other people, that many, many other people say, that's worked for me, right? And then you're looking within that for the thing that works for you. And realistically, you only have to try something for a week. If you try something for an hour a day for a week, by the end of that week, you should have a very good sense of whether or not that method works for you. And I always say the best way to tell if that method is working for you is to look at the impact that it has in the rest of your life, not necessarily to pay attention to the impact that it has while you're meditating. Maybe while you're sitting there meditating, you're have all kinds of thoughts, and the thoughts don't slow down. A lot of people put emphasis on the thoughts. There's certain brain cycles and certain rhythms in your brain that just rhythmically activate and deactivate different networks in the brain. And some of those networks are associated with thinking. And so especially at the very, very beginning, you can kind of train this, over time, but especially at the very, very beginning, I mean, you're just kind of a victim of those brain cycles. It doesn't mean that like you're not any good at meditation. You're as good at meditation as anybody else is, because your brain is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. You can't expect to sort of break your brain, within your first few minutes of meditation or something like that, right? So maybe you feel like, while you're meditating, a meditation isn't really working very well. The thing that you want to look for is its impact on your life when you're not meditating. All right. So how are you in terms of your reactivity in the rest of your life and things like that? Does it seem to be improving your life when you're not meditating? That's usually a pretty good sign that you're in line, that a method is in line for you. It doesn't have to be something that gives you some sort of profound experience on a temporary basis while you're in meditation, especially not if it's doing that, and then in the rest of your life, you're finding yourself more moody or whatever else, right? Sort of in the wrong direction of a technique working for you in a more meaningful and deeper way, even though it might seem like it's giving you really cool experiences, right? So you basically want to look across the stuff that lots of people have used and have said worked for them. Even if lots of people is only 5% of the people who have tried it, that's actually a pretty good success rate for a meditation method, believe it or not. And then you want to do it for an hour a day, because there is an importance to getting beyond about the 42, 43 minute mark. You'll notice that there's a lot of resistance that comes up to stopping right about then. Your brain will be like, oh, we've done this enough. Oh, we've got all these things to do. Oh, well, it's not an accident that it's doing that. It's because something kind of special kicks in at that point. And so the real action sort of happens after that point. So you want to give it a shot for a long period of time, about an hour. Of course, you can go more than an hour if you want to. And you just basically want to suss out for you on a week-to-week basis, what is it that actually is working? So if you try something and it doesn't work for you, it doesn't seem to really make an impact in the rest of your life, then just switch it and go to something else. And frankly, if you just do that, and you're diligent about just doing that, that is the thing that can lead you to persistent non-symbolic experience far more rapidly than just about anything else. That puzzled me for many, many years. We had many, many people who participated in the early form of the study, and they transitioned in like a week after virtually no meditation. And then you have other people in the study that had been at it for 60 years before they transitioned. And so it took us a while to sort of figure out that there was this fit problem. So those are the two things that I would say most importantly for those of you. There's a lot of new people on this webinar. And so for those of you that might not have heard that, that's my best advice in terms of transitioning. If you're having temporary experiences, that's what to do. If you're just sort of starting out and you're not sure where to begin, just pick something that a lot of people have used before and try it for a week. And if it doesn't seem to be doing much for you outside of meditation, switch to something else and try that for the next week, and then switch to something else and try that for the next week. One more sort of slightly advanced thing, and that is that when you take the Finders course, one of the things that you'll see is that the methods that we have, they're well-known methods oftentimes, not all of them, but most of them are well-known methods, and they're basically tweaked from what you will see publicly So when you're, if you're recommended, for instance, to watch your breath or something, and we have some meditations in the Finders course that involve watching your breath. The way that you're normally asked to do that is tweaked a little bit in the Finders course. And so that's also something that you should keep in mind. About halfway through the course, we do this thing where we have people take everything that they've learned up to that point in the course, which is a bunch of different methods and stuff by that point. And then we give them a couple of weeks to just basically mess around with them. We call it a practice intensive. And the idea behind the practice intensive is to just sort of figure out, to try to go back and figure out which of those methods, because you have to do a new one each session. And so we don't let you keep doing old ones in the first part of the course. And so, even if somebody had one that was really working for them, we still make them move on to the next one. It's just the way the course is structured. So that's an opportunity for them to basically go back to things that they think might have worked. It's also an opportunity for them to do some mashups. So one of the things that we talk to people about at that point is, well, maybe, if you had part of one that you felt kind of intuitively maybe was effective for you, and maybe part of another one that was intuitively effective for you, try to do both of them. Try to sort of mash those up in different ways. Maybe spend 30 minutes on one and 30 minutes on another, or 20 minutes on one and 40 minutes on another, as an example. Or maybe create some sort of combined practice that involves both of them. So I think the other thing that I want to really leave you with, for those of you who are just trying to transition, is that you do not have to use methods exactly as they've been prescribed for whether it's just a few years since somebody made one up that's working really well, or whether it's thousands of years that one's been around. These are averages, right? Ultimately, you're looking at averaged methods, especially for ones that have been around for thousands of years. That's what's worked on average for more people. Again, even for the most successful ones, relatively small percentage of people. But that's what's worked basically on average over the years for people. You're not average, right? You're not an average that's likely to just sort of naturally fit into that type of meditation. And so we've sort of taken these methods and tuned them a little bit for modern life, if you will. A lot of the old ones are the ones that we've tweaked in the Finders course. The newer ones we haven't tweaked as much, or at all, really. But the older ones we do tweak, and we kind of tweak them, and we feel like we sort of updated them for our modern brains and our modern lifestyles or whatever, because they're averaged out over these hundreds or thousands of years, and you're not living hundreds or thousands of years ago. So for you, you need to feel okay with messing around with methods, all right? Even if somebody says to you, no, this is the only method to get there, and you have to do it exactly like this, right? Just ignore them. It's okay to hack these methods up. Follow your own intuition. See what works the best for you, essentially. And then finally, the last thing I'll say about that is that methods stop working. If you get a method and it works really well for you, it's going to produce growth, and that growth is going to make you most likely fall out of alignment at some point with that method. And so you want to be sensitive to that. You want to try to figure out whether or not a method is still working effectively for you. Sometimes you go through lulls with a method. That's fine. So you can, maybe give it a couple of weeks and see if it kicks back in for you. But if after a couple of weeks it hasn't kicked back in, probably you've fallen out of sync with that method. That method is probably going to start doing you more harm than good at that point. So you want to stop that method anyway. But that's a good opportunity for you to find the next one that works. And you can do it in the exact same way that I said a minute ago. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about that stuff? I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat before we go on here. Looks like we're up to about 50% of registrants. No questions? No questions in chat or anything like that? Isn't your definition? Yes, my definition is that it takes a year to know if you're persistent. Well, that's great. I've said it a lot, so I'm glad it's clear. I must be getting better at explaining that. Thanks. Yeah, so we use another term. We use ongoing non-symbolic experience for sort of persistence less than a year. The reason that we used PNSE was initially in the study, we had to sort of determine a benchmark. And so who are we going to include and who are we going to exclude? And we kind of arbitrarily just set it for a year. And so in that, for the last few years, we've been running the Finders course, and people have been transitioning. When they transitioned, we kind of needed a word for them or a phrase for them. We couldn't call them persistent because we'd already defined the term persistent to be more than a year. So ongoing non-symbolic experience is what we use for less than a year, for persistence. That's less than a year, meaning it's an ongoing thing that you're experiencing, you know, moment to moment, day to day, and all of that, but you just haven't hit the year mark yet. And generally speaking, if you reach 7 months, it generally sticks around. And so there's some fluctuations at the less than 7 months period, but if it's been persistent for 7 months, so realistically, if we were to reset that boundary, I might reset that boundary at 7 months, but it was an arbitrary boundary that we initially set to determine our research population. Okay, I'm wondering how you keep yourself at location 2. That's a great question. And I think one of the things that I was trying to think about is, okay, turns out there's a lot of people out there that are in PNSE that are probably going to be on this webinar. So what can we tell you? What can we talk to you about? What might you be interested in? Maybe that's a good one, because I actually do get a lot of questions about the different locations and moving between the different locations and things like that. So Dorothy, maybe we'll take your question as sort of an entryway into that type of question. So first of all, I think it's important to know, if you don't know this about us already, that we consider all of the locations great. So we basically consider the notion of location 2 being better than location 1, or location 3 being better than location 2, or location 4 being better than location 3, or 5 better than 4, and so on, as not really a good way to think about these different types of experiences. Now, there's a lot that we can say about that. Of course, many spiritual teachers only know the locations that they've experienced themselves. And so maybe a spiritual teacher, for instance, has landed in location 2, transitioned into location 3, at some point transitioned to location 3 from location 2. And that's what they teach. To them, location 3 is sort of the end of the Christian mystical path. It's a place where it's kind of love and joy and compassion from either an impersonal standpoint or a divine standpoint. It's a dual, slightly dual location. So location 1 is dual, location 2 is non-dual, location 3 is slightly dual again, but it is dual again, and then location 4 is non-dual again. The only other people that I've seen with that taxonomy that have sort of figured that out or looked into that in depth are the TM people who pull it out of the Vedas. So at location 3, right, a spiritual teacher may say, well, this is the goal. Location 3 is the goal. You need to basically get to location 3. Another spiritual teacher might say, they might have experienced location 2, but not location 3. They might keep themselves towards the end of location 2, maybe. And to them, it might seem like just experiencing sort of a single emotion that's kind of a combination of love and joy and compassion, and can be some other things, but that at the heart of it, that might seem wrong to them, right? They might be like, no, you're denying the negative emotions. Why are you suppressing that? You're suppressing part of the experience of this. And then if you think about location 4, where there isn't really an experience of emotion per se, though people can look emotional on the outside, they might appear to be having an emotional reaction. When you ask them, what are you experiencing? They're not experiencing that. It's like their conditioning is acting out, but they don't have an experience of it. That to a location 3 person will oftentimes, if you have a location 3 spiritual teacher and you come to them talking about location 4, they'll be like, no, you have totally gone off path. You are completely screwed yourself up. Where's the love? Everything is about love. I'm so worried about you. You get that kind of thing, right? And so part of the issue with these different locations is that people often feel that there's a right one to be in, and we're completely different than that, actually. We don't think that there's a right one to be in. And so our view isn't that you should just basically be pushing the pedal to the metal and going as far and as fast as you possibly can. We have the exact opposite view, which is that you should be thinking about PNSE from the perspective of really what's appropriate in your own life at any given time. So right now, for instance, you're embedded in a life. Maybe you're not in PNSE yet, right? And you hear about these different locations, and you've probably absorbed, if you're interested in this, you've probably absorbed a lot of other people's teachings, and you've absorbed a lot of books and videos and all sorts of stuff. And there's all this kind of mess of stuff in your head because maybe there wasn't sort of these clear distinctions between these different locations that you had to slot it in and all that. And so one person says, oh, there's nothing to do to get there. It just either happens to you or it doesn't. And you're just, either you're blessed or you're not blessed. And other people are like, oh no, here's how you get there. You just do this method for, between 1 day and 80 years. And, hopefully before you die, you'll reach it. And so there's all of these conflicting views and conflicting opinions. And that includes about the different experiences of it. So our view is that you're embedded in a life right now, whatever that life involves. Maybe you're married with kids, maybe you're young and in school and, in college or even high school if you're watching this. So maybe you're retired. You could live in a wide variety of different cultures that have vastly different social support systems. You could have debt, you could have no debt. There's just all sorts of different situations and circumstances that you could find yourself in. And the thing is, each one of these locations is good for different aspects of life or different types of life. And so I keep myself, for instance, at the end of location 2 because I find that it's most appropriate for the life that basically is wrapped around me at this moment, which involves like leading the transformative technology movement and other sort of things like that. It involves running a lab, running some businesses still, all sorts of stuff. So for me, if I go to location 3, I have a tendency to just sort of be a little too giving. It doesn't really allow you to keep an eye on a budget for a lab, for instance. And people come and they want something, they're just like, sure, go ahead and take that, right? And the reality is there would be no lab at the end of that week because everything would have basically been given away, right? And so location 3, not so appropriate for me. Location 4, I tend to be wanting to be alone, which is a very common thing in location 4. I don't want to meet a bunch of new people. I don't want to have a bunch of idle conversation. It's painful sort of in my brain to do that. My brain wants to use that energy to experience this amazing thing that location 4 is like. It doesn't want to have any of its energy sort of distracted to have to meet new people that want to talk about the weather or, whatever. And so consequently, I just don't meet new people in location 4, right? Or I'm very short with people in meetings because I'm just not interested in, you're just not interested in that bonding type of thing. I don't need their approval at all in any way, on any level in location 4. I don't care if I give them any approval in any way, in any location, in any way at location 4. And so that doesn't tend to produce great relationships. And so there are these sort of nuances, if you will. There's just sort of these realities that unfold at these different locations, and even for different people at different locations, because your particular psychological conditioning, as it's coming into alignment over a period of years with those locations, is going to be different. Some people are very social at the beginning of location 4, and they get less social as they go along over sometimes many, many years as they sort of deepen into location 4, just as an example. And so there's just different ways that things, for me, it's like instantaneous. Like I instantly am not interested in being around people when I'm in location 4, right? And so that's not practical given my life and given my responsibilities and the responsibilities that I've assumed for other people who work for us and students that I'm overseeing doctoral dissertations on and things like that. And you really have to make sort of those same types of decisions. And so these different locations, they're sort of handy for different stuff. We've got a lot of stuff on the nonsymbolic.org publications page that talks about these different locations. And so you can sort of suss all of that out. So what that means is that, someone can land into a location that's really not appropriate for their life. And getting to the question, and so what that often entails is people changing their life to fit the location rather than changing the location to fit their life. And part of that is because it isn't widely known that you can just shift around the continuum like this, right? So maybe someone lands in location 4, and this is their first and only experience of persistent non-symbolic experience, and it feels incredible. It's everything they've ever read about in terms of a sense of freedom. Maybe if they were reading about the love version, they're a little baffled by why there isn't any love or whatever. Or if they were expecting the divine, they're a little baffled by why there isn't a divine presence, which is in location 3 but not location 4, as an example. But nonetheless, like, they have this profound sense of freedom. They can drop the love and the God and whatever other sort of thoughts that they had that PNSE should be like, because this is just so astonishing. And then they begin to really adapt their life to this new state of consciousness. But if you understand the different locations, then you can sort of say to yourself, okay, well, here's where I've landed. Now, and I've got a mortgage, and I've got a family, and I've got to raise kids and whatever else. Should I really be doing that in location 4, or should I be trying to get to other locations, maybe earlier locations, possibly even in some instances later locations? So I don't think we'll have time. That would sort of be a webinar all its own. But there are a couple of paths after location 4, one that sort of returns emotion and one that doesn't. And so maybe they could even go to location 5, and that would be more preferable for their life, as an example. We talk about 1 through 4 primarily because I've never met anybody who landed beyond location 4. So that's as far as people have transitioned, and that's mostly what we cover publicly. Okay, so how do you do it? How do you make that shift? Well, even if you've just, and I'm just maybe going to go through a couple of them here. So let's look at location 4. I saw an old friend of mine while I was at that mountain thing that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And he was an amazing teacher in personal growth and development area. And he woke up one morning after reading sort of a spiritual book, and he woke up the next morning in location 4. And he went downstairs, and he was having breakfast with one of his daughters. And he's looking across the table at his daughter, and he's not feeling the parental love that he felt the day before, and he's feeling kind of alien, which you can definitely feel that way if it's a light, sort of this light switch from normal consciousness into location 4, and he's feeling sort of alien, and you don't really have a sense of agency, like you can do stuff or think about stuff or make decisions, but he's sort of watching his brain analyze what's happening to him and whether or not it's really a good thing or not a good thing. And over the course of a few months, his brain, it doesn't feel like you're making the decision, right? So his brain just sort of decides, we don't want to be here. It doesn't feel like we should raise our daughter without that parental love or whatever. And so his brain, best way to say it, sort of makes the decision that he's got to get out of this location 4 type thing. It's long before he meets me. He doesn't have a nomenclature for what location 4 is or any of their locations at that point, but he discovers the way to do it, and it's pretty much the way everybody that I've ever met has gotten out of location 4. So here's how you do it. To go back, not to go forward, but to go back. So to go back, when you, even in location 4, and especially when you're new in location 4, you still have some psychological conditioning, some triggers that haven't burned off yet, that haven't been rerouted around in the brain or dissolved or whatever. And so those can be used. Those are actually very useful. And so what you do is you try to put yourself in situations. First of all, people are just organically notice this at some point, that, oh, wait a minute, my wife pushed that deepest button, or my parents pushed that deepest button, and I felt like this little something down there where normally I don't feel anything like that. I wonder what that is. And then they realize that they can sort of lock onto that, and that they can use that to get back out of location 4. Some people, choose to ignore it so that they just keep burning off, and so that they root into location 4. So that's the other side of this, right? You don't want to focus on these things. You don't want to give them any energy if you want to stay in location 4, or if you want to move beyond location 4. But so one of the things that you can do is you can basically focus on what Kenneth Folk, who's a great teacher of social noting, really a great innovator of social noting, in one of our conversations called proto-emotions. And I thought that was a very, very good term for them, because they feel just like that. They feel like pieces that can kind of come together that might become emotion. And so you basically focus on, when you're very strongly triggered, you put yourself in situations that would have been your strongest triggers. prior to PNSE, and you'll feel just like these little tiny distant ghosty type sensations. And you can put your attention on those, and the more you put your attention on those, the more you strengthen them. The more you strengthen them, the more they'll cohere back into emotions. And once they cohere back into emotions, they'll pull you out of location 4. Generally speaking, they won't pull you entirely out of PNSE. They'll pull you to an earlier spot on the location. Sometimes they'll yank you all the way back to location 1 or 2. Sometimes you'll just be yanked back 1 into location 3. It's different for different people. It does seem to relate to sort of the emotions that you use. So if you sort of recoalesce emotions of kind of impersonal love, you don't really have a sense of the divine at that point, but you do have impersonal, everything, all the emotions are all impersonal when you're sort of reconstituting them in location 4. So if you choose an emotion like love, you have a better chance of pulling yourself back to location 3. If you choose a negative emotion, you have a better chance of pulling yourself back to earlier in location 2 or to location 1. Somewhere. If you choose another type of positive emotion that isn't love or joy or compassion, so if you choose maybe gratitude or something like that, then that'll pull you back more likely into location 2, as an example. And so you can sort of tune a little bit of where you land, we've learned over time, from how that process unfolds for you. Okay, now if you've experienced more than one location, you're in good shape. Like if you landed in location 3 and progressed to location 4, landed in location 2 and progressed to location 3, and you decide you want to be back in location 2, the good news is that your brain basically remembers what location 2 was like, and your brain remembers the connections that were associated with location 2, because as you may have heard me say in other videos, including I think the video that I made for the end part of the survey, which led into this webinar today, your connections in your brain, unless you have brain damage of some kind, like by that I mean literally physical brain damage of some kind, generally speaking, connections in your brain don't go away. And that's just been reinforced in recent work in the last year or so, published work in the academy and sort of the science of neuroscience, where that's been a debate, it's been an ongoing debate, but it seems to become increasingly definitive that although networks in your brain and connections in your brain and stuff can atrophy, they're still there, they can still be reactivated, they can still be brought back up. And so when you think about location 2 is a certain set of connections that are more active at that moment, right? Location 3 is a different set that's more active at that point. And so if you've been in location 2 and gone to location 3 and want to go back to location 2, just to choose an example, these could be any locations, your brain already is wired for the experience of location 2. And the easiest way to do that is by just really sitting quietly and trying to immerse yourself as much as you possibly can in the feeling of what it was like to be in location 2. The more you do that, the more you're sort of kickstarting and flowing energy back into those circuits. So most people who are fluid across locations, this is essentially how they shift between locations. It's by simply bringing up a very strong memory of what that other location felt like. And the easiest way to do that is generally to begin focusing on it when you don't have any distractions, which is why I say just sort of sitting quietly and trying to bring it back, trying to sort of get your foot in the door that way. But you don't just do it that way. Then you need to bring that sort of forced perception, if you will, of the other location into as much of the rest of your life. So, when I'm doing this, for instance, at this point, I don't really have to sit quietly anymore. But I did go through the phase where I had to sort of sit quietly to sort of remember and reimburse, sort of re-strengthen or recall or whatever, what that felt like, right? But then once that's up even just a little bit, the next goal is to sort of bring it to the rest of your world, bring it to the experience of the rest of the world. So you open your eyes, you get up, you walk around, you try to hold that same sense, even if it's a very, very faint sense, even if it's an incomplete, faint sense. It's almost like what I described, where you have these proto-emotions and you're sort of focusing on them until they coalesce and pull back together. You're sort of doing the same thing with remembering what that other location was like. And so if most people who are trying to get into a different location have been in more than one location. And so that's the easy way to do it. And over time, you can get really, really adept at that. And you can do it really, really quickly. You'll probably find that some locations are easier to shift into for you than others. And that's also, incidentally, how you can drift back up. You'll probably have traumas in your life, things that occur that might pull you down into like maybe from location 2 to location 1. That happens to me from time to time, where I'll be going through there will be some intense conditioning that's coming up for me that's just a life situation that has never come up since I've been in PNSE. And so there's this whole treasure chest of conditioning that's just sitting there waiting to be unpacked, you know. And if that stuff is really, really strong, it can pull me down out of location 2, even into location 1. And one of the easiest ways to get, for me anyway, to get back into location 2, or if I want to go to location 3, I like to often spend like the holidays and stuff in location 3 when I don't have the other responsibilities and stuff, just as an example. Occasionally I go to location 4. It's mostly for research. So the way that I do that is simply with this process. And it's just basically bringing back the flavor, you know, really trying to re-immerse myself, sort of forcing a re-immersion of what that other location is essentially like that I'm trying to get to. And you can jump them. You can go from like 1 to 3 and stuff like that. But it's a lot harder. It's a lot easier to sort of go from 1 to 2 and from 2 to 3. And I find that it's harder for me to get to location 4 because I don't do it that much. So it takes a period of time. It can take a period of time for me to get to location 4. Whereas if I want to go from 2 to 3, I mean, I can go from 2 to 3 while I'm on this call, basically, at this point. And so you'll also see that there are sort of differences in your ability to move between them. Some of those will be practice related. Some of them will just sort of be how you're wired or what you're capable of at any given time or whatever. Okay, now if you haven't experienced another one, if you haven't experienced another location and you land in, say, location 3, and you think to yourself, well, location 3 is really awesome, but I'm running a business and it's costing me, you know, my business is unraveling, and that's a true story that I've heard from more than one person. And so I need to shift to some place where I'm not giving away the store. A lot of the examples I use, they're from basically really every example I use is from someone. Lots of times they're from many other people, because I figured that, you know, if I choose examples that I've heard from many different people, they'll resonate with more of you who are listening. And so you land in location 3, and then the question is sort of, how do you get to location either 2 or 4? Probably 2 if you're in this example and you're wanting to run a business of some kind. Because if you shift to location 4 and you don't really want to be around people, that's not so good, right? Unless, I don't know, unless your business is creating hard, you know, artificial intelligence algorithms and you just don't need to speak to anybody or something. And people are willing to tolerate the fact that, you know, you're not very social as long as you just keep sending them useful blocks of code or something. For most people, though, I don't think that would be appropriate. And so you'd really be looking to pull yourself back into location 2. And so that's an example of a transition that's trickier. It's probably easier to pull yourself from 3 to 1 than it is from 3 to 2. And the reason for that is because 3 and 1 are both dual, and 3 and 2 are dual and non-dual. And so it's harder to get yourself to shift from a dual state into a non-dual state than from a dual state to another dual state. And so in that instance, you'd sort of have a little strategy, right, associated with this. Now, interestingly, although that's true when you're trying to go back, that's not as true when you're trying to go forward. And so if you land in 2 and you're trying to get to 3, it is difficult to go from 2 to 3 for a lot of people. There's many people who want to go, you know, they hear the descriptions of 3 and they're like, that's really where I want to be. I'm fine with 2, you know, they're like not seeking or don't view it that way, but they're just like, yeah, you know, I'd like to experience that. And so they try to put a little energy into, you know, getting to location 3 or whatever. And that can be a hard move, but it's not as hard a move as if you've landed in 3 and are trying to go back to 2. Trying to shift to location 2 instead. So how do you do that? How do you move from a location 3 to a location 2? Well, one way is, first of all, the sort of fake it until you make it sort of method. Even though you don't have an experience of location 2, because of our work, you have some idea of what location 2 is at least like. And so if you think about this, you can say, okay, well, location 2 isn't really about the divine or a panpsychic sense, which is, if you don't have the divine version, you get kind of the panpsychic sense in location 3, which is like everything feels like it's conscious and all of that. It's dual. It's non-dual, not dual, right? And so you don't feel like you're in union with something like you do in location 3. If you're in union with something, then there's something to be in union with. In location 2, there's just sort of this thing, this one unified thing showing up, and it's just you. And so you can't really be in union with something per se in location 2, as an example. And so there are these differences that you can pick up, essentially, and just putting those in your brain can help to move in a certain direction, and vice versa. If you're trying to move further in the continuum, it can also help that as well, because you're kind of giving your brain sort of some sort of intellectual sort of target to move towards. Okay, so the other thing is that you can use methods that are more tuned to location 2 than location 3. And those are methods that there's a couple of classes of these types of methods. One type of methods are somatic-based methods. And so one thing that happens as you move further along the continuum is that you sort of become increasingly disassociated, if you will, though don't view that as a bad term. I don't view that as a negative term. I don't mean that in a pathological, clinical sense of the term. But you become sort of more disassociated from your body than you are at earlier places on the continuum. And so, and that's just fine, right? Again, don't view that in any sort of negative way. And in fact, people think that they're more in tune with their body, right? The only reason we know they're not is because we've tested them, and other people have tested them as well, like Richie Davidson at University of Wisconsin-Madison did a great study with undergraduates and like these advanced Tibetan monks and like counting their heartbeats or something like that, if I'm remembering right. And, you know, the monks were like, we're going to kick those undergraduates' butts, right? And the undergraduates like, we're going to suck at this. And the undergraduates wind up, you know, doing great at it, and the monks don't do as great. And so there's this sense you feel like, oh, I'm completely in tune with my body now and whatever else, but that's actually not the case. And so moving back into somatic-based things that really sort of force you to be more aware of your body can hold you and can pull you down from a location 3 to a location 2 or a location 1 type experience. And so somatic psychotherapy, other somatic types of therapy, those are sort of things that can do it. Another thing is in location 1 and 2, you are, you still have a mix of positive and negative emotions. And so you can try to work with methods that work with uncovering you know, negative experiences, if you will, from the past. So if you know that you went through this trauma or that trauma when you were younger, and that there's probably some negative emotion to be experienced there, it's sort of like the move from 4 to 3 with the proto-emotions. If you can kind of get some of that, get some tinges of some of that negativity, you can latch on to those types of negative emotions, and then you can sort of pull yourself back down out of location 3 and into one of the earlier locations, either location 1 or location 2. Tough to say which one you're going to land up in with that type of strategy. So that's another example. Another example is stories. You can really immerse yourself in people's stories, in your own stories. You can do a lot of journaling about your own story. You can really, really try your best. It's going to be hard to do in location 3, but you can really, really try your best to just take an interest in story at a very deep level and a very sort of rich level and a very engaged level, because that happens at location 1 and to a lesser extent at location 2, way more than it happens in location 3 or location 4. As an example. And so it's those types of strategies, right? If you just think about a certain location, whether you want to move ahead or back, and again, that I don't mean that higher's not better, lower's not worse, right? There's just an appropriateness to these locations. So if you just think about the location that you want to move to, and you ask yourself, what is it like to be there? You can go out and you can find methods essentially that are more likely to be associated with that place, whether they're traditional psychotherapy methods or whether they're standard, some sort of positive psychology thing, or they don't have to be meditation, or they don't have to be anything that's ever been considered religious or spiritual or anything like that. There's all sorts of different options to shift around like this. Okay, that was a really good one. Thank you for bringing that out. I probably have never said any of that on camera before. Okay, let me just look back. I don't want questions that like occurred a long time ago to get lost in the sands of time. So let me scroll way back here and let's see here. So related. I thought I heard that you experienced location 4. Do you choose to stay in location 2? I think I've answered that one. Laura, can you talk about the effect that is experienced as an experiencing non-symbolic experience while on this webinar or being in the vicinity of others who are PNSE? Is that a method? That's a good question. Is being around other people who are in PNSE useful? Our data on this is inconclusive. My personal take on it is that we just haven't had time to really dig into that question enough to answer it more fully. And anecdotally, what seems to be the case in the data is that just like with a method, you can match up to a person, and you can match up to a person's energy, and matching up to a person's energy can be helpful. So, there are some spiritual teachers, for instance, who give transmissions, right? They give spiritual transmissions. And when you ask their students, like some of their students have these profound experiences from their transmissions, and other students feel nothing from their transmissions. And oftentimes the teacher will say something like, well, even if you're not experiencing it, you're still getting the benefits of it or whatever. And I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe that's not true. It's tough to say. But what seems to, then there are people who travel around to different teachers, right? Or there's like the satsang circuit in non-duality, right? In the non-dual world, where like if you happen to live near somebody who hosts satsangs, which is just meetings with non-dual teachers who are supposed to be in something like location 2, for instance, and you have a new teacher that comes in once a month or once a week or every couple of weeks or whatever it is, whatever the schedule is at your satsang, sometimes people talk about experiencing something from a teacher, and other times like another teacher won't do anything for them. And so what we kind of suspect but haven't really looked into experimentally yet, and so I just want to caveat this as it's just an anecdotal thing right now, is that just as you can match up to methods, it may be possible for you to match up to sort of people's vibes, if you will. And so that's sort of the best answer I have for you on that one. Let's see. Ross says, do you actually follow up with FC participants to see if they're PNSE for a year after? Otherwise, can you determine if it's PSC or a halo effect of sorts, depending upon the continuation of the practices? So we follow up as best we can. People, generally speaking, don't like to, I guess here's the deal. We basically require so much data from them during the course that they're just don't want to fill out any more surveys. They don't have to. And I totally understand that. So we get at this data in other ways. We have gatherings, or like we started an Explorers course thing, which took 100 people into. And I'm probably just going to keep that running forever, as far as I can tell at this point. It's basically sort of a good symbiotic thing where we can continue to get data from people, and then we can continue to support them in different ways as they go along and stuff like that. And so the answer is it's very hard to get people to continue providing us with the level of data that we want. We hear from people who fall out of it. We hear from people who didn't transition during it, who transitioned in it. And generally speaking, we're pretty confident that the numbers hold up at this point. Jonathan, can you talk about the locations past 4? I know you want me to do that probably, but that would be we'll just do a whole separate webinar on that maybe at some point, or just video or something, because that would take a long time. I'm losing you with this location thing. No problem. Just check out the summary paper at the top of nonsymbolic.org on the publications page, and you'll see in that summary paper that it has a summary of the locations, and there's videos and other interviews and stuff on there where I talk about them some more as well. Paul, what if any book describes these locations? Again, just that paper. Can you talk more about what you mean by keep myself at location 2? What effort is required to remain in persistent non-symbolic experience? So I have a natural tendency to want to drift up to location 3. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that people often have a kind of a natural sweet spot at any given time on the continuum. Now, maybe that's a sweet spot that they're going to have for their whole life, or maybe it's a sweet spot that's only going to exist for a certain period of time. So for me, if I'm not sort of actively engaging processes in certain ways within myself, I have a natural tendency not to fall out of PNSE, but to drift up to location 3. And as I said, location 3 is kind of out of sync with my current life, unless it's like the holidays and everybody's on vacation, or whatever else. Sort of that period between Christmas and the Consumer Electronics Show in early January. So that's what I mean by that. Wow, that makes so much sense. Awesome. Can confirm I'm in 4. Cool. How did you know that Headless Way was one of the gold standard practices? Oh, all the gold standard practices basically came from the 7 or so years of research that preceded the Finder's Course portion of our work. And so that, one of the things that we asked people on an intake form, all of those subjects were, what worked for you? And to be honest, we didn't look at that for a long time because I had a very technological bent. Before I was into psychology and neuroscience, I had like graduate degrees in computers and business and stuff like that. And so I have this very technological side to me. And I thought, well, we'll knock this thing out with neurofeedback, or we'll knock this thing out with brain stimulation or whatever else. We won't need to worry about people's subjective experiences. That's all very messy. And so we never even looked at that question for a long time, until it became clear that we were years away from being able to have technology advance to the point where we could use neurofeedback or use stimulation. The reason for that is just because the regions of interest, they're very, very deep in the brain, and the technologies are just not that good at getting there yet. So then we went back and we looked at this question, which would basically just ask people what worked for you to transition. And the methods that we use in the course basically shook out from there. Jonathan, do people reach a certain location? Do people who don't reach a certain location reach that location later, depending on continuing, sorry, my screen is a little wigging out here, depending on continuing using the methods, or is it random as to when and how people enter a certain locations? Both. Frankly, there are some, traditions out there that have hacked a very consistent path to a certain location. For instance, Christianity. If you look at their works, the works of their mystics, they often have a very specific path laid out. Sort of lands you kind of around location. Well, it really goes from location 1 a little bit to location 2, then to location 3, and that's the end sort of for them. So you can be following sort of a trail of breadcrumbs and advice, honed over centuries like that. Or you could be in the Finder's Course, where we talk about which method is more in tune with, which location and stuff like that. Or, if you don't have any of that, then it can just sort of be this random happenstance. What we found, let me add a little layer to that. So right around 1996 in the data, it seems like there's a lot more people that start to transition to PNSE than before that. And there's a difference between the people that come after that and the people that come before that. And I think it's mostly an artifact of the internet and information being available and people being able to be much more easily found and communicated with and whatnot. I don't think that there's some like esoteric, the stars came into alignment a certain way or anything like that thing behind this. But prior to that, what we see is that it took people a lot longer. That there often was sort of an element, seemingly more of an element of luck involved with transitioning from one location to another. Most people in the data before that point didn't transition from one location to the next. They landed in a location, they deepened in it, and they basically believed that that was the right version of it. And that's why you saw a lot of conflict between different teachers and stuff, kind of arguing about, no, my version of it's the right version. You sound so close. I think you're just almost right there, but you just have this little thing off. It's about love, it's not about no emotion, or no, it's not about emotion. It's about, whatever. Right. And so, as a result of that, there's kind of a change that's occurring, and you do have people moving a lot more across the continuum now and things like that. And so it's a little bit more complicated of an answer than maybe you thought might be the case. For those needing more information on locations. A good page to check out various articles is, and then there's a colon. I think, oh, there it is. Yep, there's nonsymbolic.org publications. Thank you very much for pasting that in there. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be available. Next one. I have not seen any of your material before this morning. I'm not familiar with your language. What states are these that you, what are the states that these words refer to? Probably at this point you've started to pick it up pretty cleanly. So that's a good question. I can back that out. There's others I'm sure that are wondering that. So if you go to like the Science and Non-Duality Conference, you've seen that or heard of that, or you can go to that page and you can look up who their speakers are and stuff. Most of the people who go to the Science and Non-Duality Conference, most of the people who are in the non-duality world, sort of the Neo-Advaita kind of world, that might be one group of people that maybe you've heard of or are familiar with. Most of those folks are around location 2. Occasionally someone in that world is in location 3 or location 4. But mostly they're around location 2, as an example. If you think about the classic end of the Christian mystical path, with it feeling like you're in this divine love and all of that, this union with the divine and all of that, that's kind of location 3. Location 4, I think I've described pretty well as a sense of no agency, no emotion. The divine falls away, but there's a sense of freedom that accompanies it that is unlike anything before it. You get to location 3. People get to location 3 and they're like, "It can't be any better than this. This has to be the peak of what's possible for humans." And then they fall off the end of that into location 4 and they're like, "Holy cow, there's a whole other level of freedom beyond location 3." And so it's sort of just these very different types of experiences. Let me back out and answer that in another way, and in a more broad way, in terms of how we think about this shift. And I've talked about this, I think, in one of the videos related to the survey and whatnot. So another way that we view this is from an evolutionary perspective, frankly, from the standpoint of evolution of consciousness. You know, if you think about it, there's a certain point in the Middle Ages where all of a sudden paintings go from being flat to having perspective. Right? I mean, before that, it's like, you know, here's one figure drawn, and this figure might be a mile away, but they're drawn like right here, right next to the other figure. And there just isn't there doesn't seem to be depth perception that's represented artistically or whatever. And so a lot of the evolution of consciousness scholars believe that there's just this point in human history where depth perception just switched on across a wide range of the population. And suddenly in art around the world, you start to see depth perception being represented. And so there's this notion that there are these shifts in human consciousness that can occur periodically, and that there's early harbingers of them, but that at a certain point they become more accessible for the rest of the population. And so marry that to the notion of our genome moving very, very slowly. Tony Robbins likes to say we're wired for 2 million years ago. I like to say we're wired for 1 million years ago. It doesn't really matter which geneticists you're subscribing to. The gist is that our genes change really, really, really slowly. So you're wired for hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago, depending upon the part of you that we're talking about. But you're not living hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago. You're not living in a situation where you have to worry about some tiger ripping your arm off, or you starving because, the food supply is scarce or whatever. You're living in a very, very safe environment. You'll most likely live to old age, never be a victim of any kind of violent crime or anything like that. You'll probably spend your time between now and old age trying to resist the chocolate cake, if you're like me, right? So you're more likely to count calories and try to, maintain your weight than you are to worry about starving. There's just, our habitat has changed, essentially. The human habitat has dramatically changed. And even if you think about how it's just changed in the last 40 years or 50 years, it's been huge changes. 20 years, there's been huge changes. And so we're really not equipped. Our consciousness, the way that we experience the world, I don't mean that in some kind of woo-woo consciousness way. I mean our conscious experience of the world is not wired for this moment in time. It's wired for 100,000 years ago, hundreds of thousands or millions even of years ago, depending on the aspects of it. And so one of the things that we think is going on here is that if you think back to earlier figures who became famous for this, people like Buddha or whatever, who sort of talked about some forms of these shifts that can occur in conscious perception. There seems like there have been these early harbingers, and that now we're at a point where this is becoming more widely available and more widely accessible to people. And the switch that occurs really feels a lot like it brings you into alignment with the modern environment that we all live in. So for instance, for most people, that old wiring produces a psychological baseline that's based on fear and worry and a sense of scarcity, that you're not going to find the next berry bush before you starve, and whatever else, right? You're not going to hunt the next thing before you burn your last calorie and die. All of that stuff isn't really true of our environment. For most people listening to this, that's not to say that there aren't people living in parts of the world where that's not still very true, because certainly there are. Humanity has a lot of diversity of experience. But for those of us who are listening to this webinar, none of that's probably true anymore. And so why are we wired for it, right? Why is our conscious experience constantly viewing the world through these lenses of fear and worry and scarcity? And so we accumulate all this stuff that we don't need because our scarcity mechanisms are so deeply entrenched in us, right? We just keep buying more and more stuff and acquiring more and more stuff and whatnot. Or whatever, you get the idea. So what happens with the shift to persistent non-symbolic experience or ongoing non-symbolic experience, if it's less than a year? I'm just going to use PNSE because it's easier to use one term. So I kind of mean them both a little bit when I say those. When having this experience in some sort of persistent or ongoing way, whether more than a year or less than a year, is that your psychological baseline really shifts. And what happens when it shifts is that you go from that baseline of fear and worry and all of that to a baseline where everything sort of feels okay. Exactly as it is in the moment. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be triggered emotionally or whatnot, but it does mean that when you are triggered emotionally, you can look down through that triggering, and you basically, things still seem like they're okay, like they're fundamentally okay. And so this is a profound change in how you experience the world, because instead of viewing the world through scarcity and fear or whatever else, now you're viewing it through a sense of safety. You're viewing it through a sense, it's much more peaceful. You're much more at peace with everything. And you're frankly, I think, much more effective. You're less reactionary. It's not good to be very reactive. When you're reactive, a lot of your critical thinking shortcuts and whatever else. And so you're actually less effective if you're sort of living in a stress response all of the time. And so if that's not the case, you're a lot more capable. There's other changes that go along with this that you can read in the paper. Things like negative emotions fall off much more rapidly until you get to like location 2 or 3 or 4, where they're sort of gone. There's the negative chatter in your head. Just about everybody has a negative voice that's running in their head most of the time. That lessens or goes away entirely depending upon where you're at in the continuum. And so there's just all sorts of benefits associated with this. But we think of it mostly as that this seems like the upgrade that's probably sliding its way into humanity to be more akin to the modern operating environment that we're all living in. All right, so I hope that answers that fairly well for you. Could one get to the point where they can transition to the appropriate location for certain portions of the day or on a task-by-task basis? Yes, and there are people who talk about doing that. And there are people who have, I call people fluid 4s that go to location 4 and come back. So technically, I'm a fluid 4. And what that means is fluid across locations. That's where I came up with that term. It's just a little slangy, but that's what I mean by it. And so there are people who are fluid 4s who basically have been to location 4, and they're like, okay, well, we don't think location 4 is really like the end game here. So we're not going to stay in location 4. We're going to go back. And often those people have a sense that really this is almost like an athlete building different skills for their sport. Right? So maybe if you're a basketball player, you have dribbling and shooting, you have defense, you have offense, you have all of these different jumping, you have just all of these running, you have all these different skills that you have to build. They view sort of PNSE, different locations in PNSE, as different skills that you build to interact with your environment. And that should basically move, and it should basically eventually become sort of so dynamically fluid that the right one is up at any time. So that's another way to think about this. I don't think that there's right or wrong ways to think about any of this. I think that's a perfectly fine way to think about this. And then if you want to sort of get to that point, that's fine. So I know people who have gotten very close to that, if not to there. It takes, a fair amount of effort. Those people are not lightweights, just to make that clear. David, after you do, you can rewatch the webinar. Okay, yep. Posts. I'm going to leave the later location stuff for later. What do location fours talk about when they get together? Are they social with other location fours? Yeah. And in fact, I would say this is true of PNSE people in general. I feel like I'm very blessed in that I spend almost all of my time dealing with people who are in PNSE. So when I went to that thing on the mountain last weekend or whatever, and I was immersed in a situation where there were a lot of really brilliant, really accomplished people who were not in PNSE, that was an unusual circumstance for me. And it wasn't, I mean, I would say, I would much prefer to be around PNSE people than ordinary people, not wanting to upset anybody out there who's not in PNSE yet. But one of the things that happens, and I mentioned it with location 4, and it's an extreme example of it in location 4, is that you become interested, for instance, just a lot less interested in stuff like stories, right? Like I remember somebody in the current run of the Finders course, as I make this video, was talking, basically had a glimpse, their first glimpse of non-symbolic experience. And on the other side of it, the thing that stood out to them most was like, oh my God, people are just wasting all of their time talking about all of these bullshit stories about whatever, right? I mean, who knows if most of them are even true, and so you do sort of get that sense, and as a result, it becomes sort of just less interesting to stand around having, all these story-based conversations. You don't care as much about your own story, your own history, your own whatever. You don't care much about other people's stories or whatever. It just seems like they're just hung up in these delusional stories that aren't really serving them, frankly, in any way. And you've kind of been fortunate to shed yours for the most part, regardless of where you're at on the continuum. And you're feeling good about that, and you're wanting to shed more and more of yours, because the more you do, the better the experience of the world seems to get. So you're not wanting to, and so when you're engaging with other people around their stories, of course, it's going to activate the parts of your own brain that have to deal with story-to-story based communication. And if you're not in a place where stories feel good to you, activating the part of the brain that's story-to-story based communication is just not all that desirable, right? So consequently, you just don't really enjoy those types of conversations. However, when someone, and there's another great analog to this, like oftentimes you'll see very advanced spiritual teachers who will tell people that come to them for questions. They'll be like in a big audience or something, and then they'll open it up for questions, and they'll basically say, like, I'll only answer questions about the methods that I'm teaching you and how to do them right. The reason for that is because they're sort of in that same place. Like, they don't want to spend, when you talk to them and you say, hey, why are you doing this? Like, I've been able to. They're like, I don't want to spend time reinforcing people's bullshit stories or waste other people's times hearing other people's stories or whatever else. It's like they just need to basically sit down and do the work that I'm telling them to do and get beyond all that stuff. So I don't want to waste any of my time reinforcing that or whatever. And so that's kind of the way that these sorts of things unfold. So when you're with other PNSE people, things like that, if I'm telling a story and I'm with another PNSE person, or they're telling a story to me, I know that they've basically decided that the most accurate way that they can convey a very specific message that they're trying to convey is with the story for some reason. And so I will take that story very, very seriously. Because I know that there's some sort of meaning that they feel like they can't directly express in another way that they feel is important to the exchange we're having. But generally speaking, you don't sit around exchanging stories, but I have a very, very rich social life with the PNSE people that are around me. And that can even extend all the way up into location 4. For sure, because you're basically talking from one location 4 space to another location 4 space, and that's totally fine. It doesn't activate those parts of the brain that you're like don't want to have activated, or that feel like they're a waste of neural energy or whatever else. I experience components of all locations. That's not at all uncommon. People often say, I feel a little of this and a little of that and whatnot before one of them sort of roots in. And there are also, to go along with that, there are fringes between boundary areas, if you will, between locations. So like you can go from location 3 to location 4, you might have your sense of agency fall away, but you might still be feeling divine love, as an example. And then as you phase a little bit more close to location 4, maybe the sense of the divine will fall away. So you'll have no agency, no sense of the divine, but you'll still have a feeling of love until you sort of slide your way into, and that will show up at different orders for different people. So somebody might have love fall away first and agency fall away last, as an example. So it's kind of these interesting sort of boundary regions, if you will, between these, where people can kind of phase into them. Rebecca, I seem to be fluid between, whoops, let me make sure I didn't skip one here. Jeff, it would be great to create a forum where we could share. This is very interesting. I've been in 4 for 20 years. Yeah, I agree with that, for sure. We have some of that for Finders Course alumni. It would be interesting, I think, to, and we have a private Facebook group for them and stuff like that, but nothing more public than that. Maybe we can vote for the Finders Course people and see if they care if other people come in, as long as they take the time to read the paper and understand the language and stuff. Rebecca, I seem to be fluid before location between L2, 3, and 4 happens naturally depending on life situation. That doesn't surprise me. Have you mapped Kundalini experiences onto locations? No, we haven't. And in fact, one of the things that there's a missing dimension, I think, in our data. And it's the energetic stuff. And the reason it's missing is because we ask cognitive science-based questions to get people ready for fMRI and EEG work. And so I wasn't asking them questions relating to energy flows in their body or anything like that. And so that dimension is not represented in our work. Find music to listen to in 4, then maybe it can trigger you later to get back. Sure, yeah, whatever can trigger. Let's see, how long would it take to become good at switching locations? Totally varies. Some people are good at it right away. Took me about a year. Some people, they never get good at it. Let's see. Any possibility of doing a trauma-informed program that includes the input of diversity inclusion professionals? Trauma-induced behaviors arise as I move through FC10, and my sense is that I'd have an easier time of it within this sort of program. That's a good question, and I've had that question. I've had that question before, and we've actually looked at that a little bit in research. And so for most part, that's why we exclude people from Finders Course that have had any sort of, serious mental health issues or something like that, because it's sort of not tuned for that. However, what we learned is that it was better to basically, that those traumas essentially are kind of useful in terms of how they come up in FC, and that's going to be a whole other webinar now that I think about it, getting into that. But let's just say, yes, we have thought about that. We've sort of, the way it is that we've sort of the way we've decided on it, based on the data and what we think is best right now. David, are you on the continuum, Judith? Blah, blah. Let's see. Are you using tapping, the Sedona method, EFT, right? Those are some methods that we mentioned for people that do have trauma come up in the course. Let's see, Sedona method, focusing, depth therapy. How would location 1 be better than location 2? Isn't location 2 a deeper, better version of location 1? No, originally we thought that. And actually, let me clear that up because I haven't rewritten the summary paper for that since 2010. And we've learned a lot about it since then. I think in 2010, when I wrote the summary paper, I really regarded location 1 and 2 as not that different from each other. But I've since come to realize, and so I think the summary paper probably, I don't think we used dual and non-dual in the summary paper, but if back in 2010, I would have regarded location 1 as probably non-dual. And so it's only through the Finders Course and a lot of being able to have really rich iterative experiences that we've realized that 1 is dual, 2 is non-dual. And so that's a big difference between location 1 and 2. As an example, this is a living research project, right? I mean, we learn new stuff about this every day. So the big shift in location 1, if you're wondering, is that deep psychological shift into peace and stuff like that. So how would location 1 be better than location 2? Isn't location 2 a deeper, better version of location 1? Well, I think it depends on one's preference for non-dual versus not non-dual experience. That's one very simple way to answer this question, because maybe location 3 isn't appropriate for you. And there's just something about a location 2 non-dual experience that for some reason doesn't seem to be desirable for the current environment that you find your life in. And let me address a little bit about why that can be. It can be a little alienating, actually. If you don't have a support community around you, people that are in location 2, people that are having a non-dual experience in location 2, have no one to talk to. And that can be very, very isolating if that's the case for you. And so it's sometimes it can be preferable to actually be shifted back into location 1 and to not have to deal with that discord or that dissonance between you and literally everybody else in your life. And there are people who make that decision, actually. And so there's like, just all kinds of different reasons that people can make involving these. And there's different versions of non-duality even within, as you move across and deepen into location 2 and stuff. And some people prefer some of those versus others. And so there's also tuning within locations. People answering some questions about the course. Is the typical end of Buddhist practices location 4? Not necessarily, no. What we've learned is that and I'm not a religious scholar, so let me just caveat that. This comes from the religious scholars that have found us and want to talk to us about our work and stuff. So what I've learned and also from sitting down with teachers who were part of the research participants, basically, that were like Buddhist teachers and things like that. So one of the things that I've learned is that different sects of Buddhism definitely have very different endpoints. And I think that that's actually a rich study for maybe a doctoral student or somebody like that to do. Like, I've noticed that there's this notion of bodhisattvas, and some of the scholars that sit down with me basically regard bodhisattvas as location 3. And location 4 is going beyond that, and have some sects basically saying, you should just be a bodhisattva. You shouldn't go beyond this point. And if you do, there's the cave. The cave is up there. Go to the cave. And when they see our data, they're like, that makes a lot of sense, because it doesn't sound like a bunch of location 4 people are fun to live around if you're not in location 4, whereas location 3 people are probably really great to live around. So, maybe you want to have, just as a political decision at some point back in Buddhist days made. So they have like talks with me about stuff like this or whatever, right? But I also think that I can view that from other perspectives, right? Because when you go beyond location 4, there's this sort of bifurcation that occurs. There's kind of this fork in the road, and there's sort of this way where emotions kind of reconstitute back in, and this is a shorter path. It doesn't go to as many further locations as this path, which remains emotionless. And so it's also possible that this bodhisattva ideal deals with, if you're a bodhisattva, you go beyond, you hit location 4 and you go beyond location 4, but you take this one, and your emotions kind of come back in certain ways. There's reconstitution of the senses in certain ways that are different than this path over here. And this path over here, people are often very service oriented. You could sort of see that bodhisattva service to all people, we're not going to move on until everybody wakes up sort of notion in this experience. You definitely don't see it in this experience, right? In this experience, it's like, I don't care if I'm the only one left in the world, that kind of thing. So I could also view some of this stuff through those lenses, right? And part of the problem is I'm just not a scholar in any of that. I'm not that interested in it. We only collect data from living subjects. We don't read into books, don't read articles, don't read, if I can't ask you questions and query you and collect data from you, physiological data and stuff like that, you're basically it's not in our data set. So that's what I would say about that. What's going on in the brain at different locations? That's definitely another webinar. We don't have that kind of time today. What's the best or fastest way to burn off negative conditioning? I think we'll do a series of training on that. That's a really, really good question. I'm going to hold that question, because that's just a rabbit hole that I could talk about for hours. Let's see here. When you say more people have been transitioning, how do you control that it's an absolute number and not more finding you, and that your work is not more visible? Yeah, so I guess there's no way to know to some degree from a sample standpoint because we're not paying Gallup to just randomly call 10,000 households or something, right? So we do have to keep that in mind from a statistics standpoint. But generally speaking, these people are all finding us because if our work becomes more visible, as an example, these people are all finding us. First of all, that would have been 1996 would have been about the time. Well, that would have been way before our work even started. We started in 2006. So it wasn't just that people started finding us more around 1996 or something. So the people that we were attracting, and the people we've attracted the whole time have sort of either woken up before that or after that and that kind of thing. But sure, I think you do have to keep that in mind. I do think that so many thousands of people at this point. And so these patterns to me seem pretty solid. Have you thought about revising PNSE to cut off 7 months instead of 1 year? Yeah, but I've just got it out there on everywhere at this point. It's well established for 10 years as a year, so that's where we're going. How does PNSE, Jonathan, how does PNSE affect authors who write novels for a living? That's a really great one. As I think some of you know, a dear friend of mine, Rod Pennington, wrote as a major screenwriter and novelist, writes novels for other people when he's not doing under his own name. I mean, the guy's written for presidents and he's rewritten. I mean, the number of things that this guy writes is astonishing. He's a very, very talented writer. And so he's the reason that there is a Fourth Awakening book, which is a fiction book based on some of the earliest notions of this research or whatever. And the idea was how do we find people in the mainstream population that might experience this and get them to contact us? So we wrote a fiction book, tried to drag people out. That worked pretty well. And that book has sold a lot. It's sold a lot of copies. It's a best-selling book at this point. The whole series is a best-selling series, frankly, at this point. So he's a great fiction writer. I didn't write a lick of that fiction. That was entirely his ability. It's humorous to me that I'm a fiction author or considered a fiction author because I'm definitely not a fiction author. And so he's a good example because he's in later locations. Let me just say that. I've never gotten permission from him to say where he's at. I think he does tell people. But he's not in location 1 or location 2 or whatever, and he's been around this stuff for a long time. And so it clearly doesn't impact his ability to be a storyteller. I mean, he was like the script fixer for The Hunt for Red October, and you name it, he's done it. And so I think that's a really good question, and I would love to know the answer to that. And we've talked about it a lot. It just seems like he's just wired to be a writer. Now, part of that may go to what someone was doing pre-PNSE. Although he's had these experiences for a very, very long time in his life, one thing that we notice is that people largely stay on the same trajectory. And so, if I'm like working in computers or something, and I shift into PNSE, I pretty much keep my job and stay working in computers unless I have some profound experience that makes me think I need to go be a teacher or something. Pretty much people just continue on the trajectory that they were on before. And so, like, if you think of John Greben, who wrote a popular book on this many years ago, he's a programmer. When I met him, he was a programmer at a meatpacking plant in Enid, Oklahoma with investment properties. And I mean, he's just like a normal guy out there kind of living his life, except that he'd written this book that influenced a lot of people. And he had sort of this profound experience or whatnot. That's common. That's way more common than becoming a teacher. And in fact, I wish more of those people would become teachers. Because I think the people who become teachers are often skewed in certain ways that maybe isn't necessarily that helpful for the population at large. Whereas if just like normal people would network around this, and that's a lot of what we try to do with the Explorers course and stuff like that. So I think Rod was probably just a talented writer before, and at some point shifts into PNSE and is still a talented writer. It's just sort of what he was put on earth to do, was be a talented writer. And so that's the best answer that I have regarding that. Because I wonder about that too. Like, he shouldn't be interested in stories anymore, right? So why is he so darn good at writing them and fixing them for other people? Triggers aren't gone in 4, but deeply submerged. There's an advantage to being a fluid 4 and going to locations where you can work on rewriting those triggers till they aren't suppressed. They disappear. Absolutely. That's one advantage of the fluidity. And we should probably do a training on that at some point, huh? Thanks for bringing that up. Let's see here. Is recalling the events of my week considered a story type communication, or does story refer to things like fiction, drama, gossip, etc.? I'm not sure I understand the difference. I've seen some psychologists say all human communication thinking is story at some level. Seems to be many uses of the word. Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, if I'm just describing sort of findings, if I say location 4 people experience this and this and this and this and this, that's very different than saying when I was walking across the lawn at a major university with a location 4 person, there were all of these beautiful co-eds laying around in bikinis for the first day of the first warm season. Turns out it was a party school. And I asked the person, hey, when you look over at that person laying there in that bikini, you know, what happens to you? You know, you're a heterosexual male. Is it like, wow, you know, is there some sexual arousal that occurs, or lust or passion or anything like that? And he says, no, you know, there really isn't anything like that. There's an orientation of my eyes. So like, that's a story, right? If I say, some PNSE people, but basically in location 4, what oftentimes people report is that their eyes orient in different ways that seem very early evolutionary to them. So they're crossing a street and, you know, their eyes orient to make sure that they aren't about to get clocked by traffic, or that occasionally if they're in an environment with a lot of beautiful women, they might orient to one of the beautiful women, but nothing arises as a result of that. There's nothing that follows on like it might for an ordinary man that wasn't in PNSE or whatever. I think that's a very sort of descriptive based versus like a story based. So that's how I'm thinking of it. I have no idea if out-of-body experience relates to PNSE. I don't have anywhere near enough data to suggest that those two are related. Which means they're probably not, because people haven't talked about it a lot. There are strange perception things that happen, like in location 4, people talk about a shift to 2D vision, to having moments where vision is 2D and the world feels like you're just stationary and the world is moving through you. So there are certainly perceptual changes like that in terms of spatial orientation and things, but out of body specifically, not so much. Is it your sense that a student that feels a transmission with a spiritual teacher deeply indicative of resonance with being in the same location? No, not necessarily. I don't really know what that is, but it just seems like some people are very helpful. And incidentally, this can even occur for people. I was in Sedona recently, and I was staying at the house of a couple of friends there who are very early research participants and long time, very well-known spiritual teachers. And one of them was talking about the impact that this other teacher's transmission had sort of had on their experience, as an example. And so it can even happen, you know, for people who've been in PNSE for a really long time, who are very sophisticated around it. It doesn't even have to be like a new thing, like for people to get into PNSE. Let's see. I predict that PNSE is a foundation for Kundalini evolution. It may simply be outside the scope of the FC. Yeah, I don't think that's the case. I have definitely heard enough from people who had Kundalini mixed in with the questions that we, I don't know if it's difficult to, I've even actually just the spiritual teachers, actually, I was having that conversation with them. So I have these conversations quite a bit around Kundalini. People experience Kundalini, stuff like that. I can tell you that the brainwave signatures are really different. And when I say different, I mean different in distinct ways, not like one leading to another one, or not in some sort of way where you're like, oh, those are clearly related. So there's some data around stuff like that. Let's see, are there any projects or plans to introduce PNSE at primary or elementary school students, or maybe at colleges or universities? Nope, not yet that I know of. And in fact, some people believe that a lot of the major traditions believe that you're not ready for it until 35 or 14 years old or whatever. They've all kind of picked their different places. And I think there's a lot of research that could go on around that, to be honest, because if you think about just brain development and brain maturation, somehow the car insurance actuaries hacked their way to a realization that the brain doesn't really stop massively changing until about age 25 or whatever, right? Like at 25, your rates dropped. They just found that out of data, right? Well, in neuroscience, we know that like one of the last big changes of, you know, the brain or whatever is around not that it doesn't always change or whatever, but is around 25. And that came way after those actuaries figured that out. And so I think there's all sorts of different brain developmental things that need to be taken into account. I've talked to people who had PNSE early in their life, and that was a great experience for them. I've talked to people who had PNSE for them earlier in their life, and it was a nightmare experience for them in terms of social integration and psychological, just standard, more traditional psychological development and whatever else. And so to me, that is a very significant open question. We choose to work with adults basically for that reason. The 4 locations bear a striking resemblance to Buddhist Brahma Viharas. They should bear a striking resemblance to every tradition, or we need to do some more work. And in fact, I know that they do because we've gone across every tradition and the leaders in it and stuff. Have you ever looked at the function of DMT in the brain of people with PNSE? Nope, haven't. We only do basically legal research, and we don't have permission to do that. Does your research include exploring shamanic work and deep shifts experiences working with ethnogen herbal medicines? Nope, we don't do any of that. We do have data that about 50% of our original population of 1,200 people that experienced PNSE had used a hallucinogen. So it wasn't statistically significant that you had to use a hallucinogen or that it did something special for you. Also, along those lines, in the Finder's course, we've seen basically drugs be more bad than good, frankly. And I recommend people that are in the Finder's course not to take drugs, not to use hallucinogens, not to use, even marijuana, whatever else, not because it's not just because it's illegal. Of course, you shouldn't use it because it's illegal. So it's unethical from a research standpoint and all of that to recommend it. But I also recommend it from the data perspective. So we've run these things. There was a period of time when a lot of the people that were coming into Finder's course were from the Bay Area and from the tech community in the Bay Area. And a chunk of those people went to Burning Man every year. And so they would, and invariably, some of them would be in Finder's course when Burning Man rolled around, and they'd go to Burning Man. If you don't know what that is, you can Google Burning Man. And so while they were at Burning Man, they would take drugs. And there was a very high likelihood that the hallucinogens that they took at Burning Man, if they were in a persistent location, like if they were considering themselves an ongoing non-symbolic experience in location 1 or 2 or 3 or something, before that, that those hallucinogens at Burning Man pulled them out of it. And so we've seen that again and again and again and again and again. And as a result of that, it makes me very, very wary about pursuing PNSE and pursuing it in relation to the hallucinogens and entheogens, and stuff like that. Now, I've also picked up data from that from other perspectives. So the people that did answer 50% yes in the course, some of those people, a subset of those people, we chose to dig into this hallucinogen question a little bit with. And one of the things that we've heard from them again and again and again and again was that they found that they didn't recommend people taking hallucinogens to reach PNSE. And often the reason for that was because they felt that it trapped them in these temporary experiences that were very difficult to make persistent, and that it gave them a false sense of what persistence was going to be like. And so they found themselves sort of chasing these temporary experiences, which were induced by these hallucinogens or entheogens or whatever, and not even giving their brain the right goal, all sorts of stuff. And so so even earlier in the research, if somebody had asked me, should I do, what do you think about hallucinogens or whatever, just beyond legal questions from a data standpoint, I would sort of answer from that perspective. But now we've actually seen it in the Finder's course. We've seen people coming back from Burning Man or just having done it, while they were in the course at home or with friends or whatever, and, filling out their next week's progress survey saying, damn it, I lost it. And then having to claw their way back to it over the course of the rest of the course or whatever else. So I would be very, very careful with that in relation to persistent non-symbolic experience. That's just from what we've seen data-wise. Let's see, have you done research around audio binaural programs for meditation awakening? There is one that we recommend in the course. Just for people to play around with. It's hit and miss. Some people love it, some people don't. It's called Sri Yantra. Sriyantra, and it's from Jeffrey Thompson, at the Center for Neuroacoustic Research. And so we're at the point in the course right now where people are supposed to use that. And so I gave them a link to that the other day, and it turns out that Jeff's website was just hacked. And so his website is offline at the moment. A couple of things about his stuff. First of all, you want to use the FLAC version or the CD version. And FLAC is a file format. FLAC is a file format. And the reason, because other types of compression screw it up. So sometimes, like, people put his stuff on YouTube. His publishers sell it in like MP3 form, or they'll sell it on iTunes and stuff like that. Don't use any of that. It doesn't work very well. So you need to get it from him either in CD form or with a download. He makes a FLAC download available. I think he has a WAV version that is also, which would be like what goes on a CD, that he also offers as a download version. But so one of those versions to really make that work. We're beginning to work with the iAwake folks. And I've just about, in the next day or so, I think probably in the current Finders course that's running, I'll put a link up in there. I've asked them for I keep hearing great things about their stuff. And so I've asked them for a link to what they think is their most helpful track at helping people reach PNSE. Now, beyond that, no. Beyond that, the only track that I can say right now has an impact for some people is Jeff Thompson's Sri Yantra track, which he developed like for some Deepak Chopra program 25 or 30 years ago or something crazy like that. He's gotten a lot of good feedback on over time, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback on in the course. Okay, it's good. More questions are coming in here. Maybe go another 10 minutes, huh? Till maybe 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, sorry. Let's see. Are you seeing any relationship between personality types like ESFP, INTJ? So those personality types I do not regard as credible from a scientific standpoint. And so no, we don't use them. We do use the Big Five for personality typing. And we are doing a deep dive on that data right now. One thing that's been very interesting from the Big Five data. So the Big Five is kind of the default way that academics look at personality, and it's things like openness, agreeableness, narcissism, stuff like that. There's 5 of those factors. They're not supposed to change much over your time, on this earth per se, right? So like you shouldn't have one score on narcissism today and another score tomorrow that's radically different, just as an example. These are supposed to be relatively durable personality traits. And we've seen things like a 50% drop in narcissism and stuff that you just shouldn't see. So we are seeing some significant effects on personality types. And we also have seen one of our research scientists, Sherry Niv, did some early work on whether some people seem more likely to have the Finders course work for them or not. And we discovered some interesting things like sort of the higher the well-being someone comes in with, the more likely they are to have the program work for them, and just some sort of things like that. So we're working in those areas as well. We're just now going through one of our research associates at the lab, Ari Burwalt, is basically going through, and he's doing a total recrunch of all of the numbers, because I crunched the numbers back in the day for Finders Course 1 through 4 because we really considered that the primary experiment and reached a certain level of statistical significance in terms of like enough people having done it and stuff. And so I crunched all of those numbers. Those are the numbers that I present academically all the time and at the conferences, and that you can see on the publications page of nonsymbolic.org and all of that. But we have all these other numbers that we haven't really crunched yet. And so we're just in the process of having Ari go. Ari's a great stats guy. And we're just in the process of having him really go back and do a full sort of recrunch right from the beginning to every single thing that we have right now. And I think a lot of amazing stuff is really going to shake out of it. So that's a bit of a stay tuned. Can you talk about any correlation between PNSE and your life starting to just flow? As I've heard in some teachers mention, no need to worry about how you will survive day to day. Money-wise, for example, that you will just flow into what is needed for you, etc. Yeah, that we don't regard as true. So I have an awful lot of destitute research participants who are in very advanced states of consciousness, and who have lost their houses and, can barely feed themselves because they're just so broke and whatever else. So, and they're from traditions that say that should be happening. And they're acknowledged in those traditions as having attained the place where that should be happening. So we don't think that that's true. We think that that's mostly what we call spiritual salesmanship. things that people have made up in order to get people to do their method or whatever else. And in fact, it's a little bit trickier than that. And this is probably something that we'll do some training on. There are periods right after you transition to PNSE. So there's like a couple of years right after you transition to PNSE. And you have to be pretty careful what you do in those years, because you're going to sort of lock in who you are and what you're doing from a PNSE perspective from that point forward. And so there are very skillful, healthy ways, to lock in living in the world that don't make you lose your house and starve. And there are less skillful ways that do make you lose your house and, have to sort of wonder where your next meal is coming from. So there is some sophistication and nuance around that. Generally speaking, yes, in our data, it's incredibly clear that that sort of manifestation flow or whatever that people want to associate with PNSE doesn't really occur. Now, does a sense of flow occur? Sure. We do see increases in a sense of flow, right? You feel like you're in a synchronistic flow, even though you lost your house, right? You contextualize that somehow that's just all in the greater good synchronistic flow, and everything is unfolding exactly as it should, and everything is perfect, and you're just meant to lose your house, and you're just meant to be hungry right now, and sort of whatever else. Does that type of experience come in? That type of experience absolutely comes in. But is there an objective sort of physical support mechanism that seems to come in with this? No. All right. I have a 2D experience all the time, but I also experience triggered emotions while not having a strong reference point for love. However, I do experience love at this point. I don't at this point have a language to talk about love. Does this make sense? Because of all this, I have trouble knowing where I land. So another place, 2D, there's a couple of different types of 2D experiences. I should nuance that out a little bit more. A lot of this I can nuance out a lot more. So in location 2, there can also be a type of 2D experience. It occurs if you think about like location 1 being here and location 3 being here, there's like this range that is location 2, right? And that's true for all of the locations on the continuum. And so like this location 2 is slightly different than this one, slightly different than this one, slightly different, and so on and so forth, right? If you get to about 2.4, there's an experience. Not everybody hits it. You don't have to go through each one of these. You'll probably experience location 2 in 1 or 2 different ways, not in a whole bunch of different ways. But there is one place that some of the non-dual community really latch onto as like the place, and it's a place where. And you have to be careful about talking about this, because this is true. I mean, so what I was going to say is my voice sounds exactly like your voice, right? Now, I'm in the end of location 2. I don't draw a distinction between how my voice sounds and how your voice sounds. So that's not the best way to say that. But all I can say is that there's a slightly different quality to it. There's a deeper sense. Like the first time I experienced it, the first time I was in location 2.4, I was at this meditation retreat, and somebody dropped a dish behind me, and I didn't realize that I was in it. And this dish sounded just exactly like me. It was just clear that dish was completely and totally me, in a slightly personal way, me. You can kind of think of it as, rather than just sort of a general, it's all me sort of way. It was kind of a very sort of personal way, me. And so that's sort of what I'm referring to there. And there's shifts in vision that occur in that particular space as well that could be considered 2D in the world moving through you and stuff like that. It's slightly different than how it shows up in that for some of those location 4 people that can shift into that at a certain point in location 4. So there's a lot of complexity around this. I try not to get lost in those weeds too much. But if, could I make a 2D experience with triggered emotions, not having a strong reference point for love? However, I do experience love. At this point, I don't have language to talk about love. Does that make sense? I mean, I could very easily slide that into that sort of 2.4 type experience, which is a very specific, very recognizable place in location 2, unlike most other places where a little more fuzzy. That one is just so different. Last question, huh? Jeanette, thank you for asking our last question, Jeanette. I would be interested in the difference in brain patterns and Kundalini. I became pure sound a few years ago. I felt your frequency in my body this morning, and this is why I listened to this webinar. Okay, cool. Yeah, right on. Yeah, so the brain patterns in Kundalini are, they deal a lot with delta. They deal a lot with very specific patterns in deep delta, and they've been seen across a number of people's work at this point. And that's very different than what happens with PNSE, where there's oftentimes a reorganization of networks in the brain. So your brain is basically just a bunch of connected spots, and there's little highways and stuff running between those different spots. And sometimes those spots are kind of always rewiring a little bit, but they're like, major highways. They don't move very often and things like that. And, connect roads between new cities that are pretty established and old cities, and between old cities that are very established, and all that, right? And so we're talking about sort of major road rewiring between some of those cities in your brain from a PNSE perspective, and that is not seen quite in the same way from a Kundalini experience, unless the Kundalini experience does seem to trigger along with it, which they don't have to, and many don't. But some Kundalini experiences do transition sort of a shift into a form of PNSE. Can be any of the different locations in PNSE. And so there is that relationship, which is why I keep Kundalini on the radar, because some people do have sort of Kundalini with that relationship to PNSE, but lots and lots of people have Kundalini stuff that doesn't seem to be related to PNSE. And so it's an ongoing research sort of area and question and curiosity for us. Okay, Michael, one more. You've mentioned creating some new training programs around topics. Are there plans for more courses, educational offerings, in addition to the Finder's course? Maybe, I don't know. We're trying to decide that now. I mean, I might just make a bunch of videos and stick them out there, So I think it all depends on how deep they have to be and whether or not you should be doing exercises with other people. And if we can structure learning in a way that we can just give it to you, that's that's preferable, because it just goes far and wide, right? We tried to do that so hard with the Finder's course, but it just didn't work. People didn't do it on their own. It was just too rigorous a protocol. They skip around, all of that. I don't think anybody ever finished the Finder's course on their own, all the times that we tried to make it available. So for that program, we can't offer it. We just learned we can't offer it that way. And so I think it depends really on what is most of service, really. If it's stuff that we can just do like this, where I can just sit here and answer questions, or I can do presentations on it like I do all over the country all the time, or whatever else, then that's the story. Okay, so I think that's all she wrote for this one. I hope this was useful to you. Thank you, Rebecca. There's a new Finder's course always sort of forming, so you can go to finderscourse.com if you're interested in the transition. For this Finder's course, it's not technology based, and so it's a smaller cohort that we're taking. It starts on March 25th. You can go to finderscourse.com and click on the apply button at the top of the page and get there if you want to get there. This is really for people who are not in PNSE. Sometimes we allow people into the Finder's course that are in PNSE because it can help them deepen and progress and stuff like that. In this research phase, we're only taking people who aren't in PNSE. And so you have to not be in PNSE to take this upcoming Finder's course on the 20th. Please do not lie on your application to us. It's very important data-wise that our data be accurate so that we can help everybody. But yeah, that's it. So thank you. Yeah, my love to you too. Thanks so much for tuning in. And, we're going to try to get a lot more of this out to you. Like I said in that video, we're always just so pressing ahead with the research. We don't take time to talk about it as much as we should. So we're going to really make a concerted effort for that. And I'm super grateful that you helped us with that survey so that I know what to talk about. Like I wouldn't have known what to talk about today without that. All right. My love to you guys. And I'll see you next time.